Hi, I'm Sarthak, an associate fellow at the Takshila Institution. I welcome you all to the first ever Takshila Deep webinar. Before we start, just a bit about who we are and what we do. The Takshila Institution is a networked think tank and a school of public policy, physically located at Bangalore, operating around the world since 2010 over the internet. As an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank, we are engaged with India's relationship with the world. We are transforming how India is governed, and we are exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. Please take a look at our policy education programs that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere in the world. We have both short-term certificate programs and we have year-long graduate programs in public policy, defense, and foreign affairs, technology, and health and life sciences. Admissions are open for the next intake. To connect with us, please subscribe to our newsletters and podcasts, depending on your interests. We deliver sharp and timely analysis that allow you to reduce the information overload and get to the heart of the matter. So this is about Takshashila. Now, one question that you might be pondering about is what exactly is a deep webinar? So the short answer is deep webinars are thoughtfully curated conversations that push the possibilities of public discourse in the digital age. In a deep webinar, you can expect great speakers, interesting discussants from diverse backgrounds, and an ability to engage with topics of your interest before, during, and after the event. You can suggest topics and speakers, post questions, post comments, and participate in real-time polls. You can check the link which has been posted on the Zoom chat. So this is about deep webinar, and this is the first deep webinar. So for the first deep webinar, we have with us Puja Mehra. She is a journalist and she's the author of The Lost Decade, the subject matter for today's discussion. She won the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award in 2008 and 2009. She has been the senior deputy editor at Hindu. She also hosts a weekly podcast, Everyday Economics. For today's discussion, we also have with us four discussants from different sections, from diverse backgrounds, and they are here to steer the conversation. We have with us Amol Agarwal. He's the assistant professor at Ahmedabad University, and his blog, Most Economics, has been consistently ranked among top 100 economics blogs world over. Anika Gururaj, she is a student at the University of Pennsylvania. She has researched on the decline in women's labor force participation rate. Harsh Vora, he's a proprietary investor and trader, and he also has consistent columns in different financial publications like LiveMint and Money Control. Subrat Mohanty, he is the group president, Manipal Education and Medical Group, and he's responsible for the group's interest in education, healthcare, and insurance. With this, I'll hand it over to Nitin, the director of Takshila Institution. Over to you, Nitin.
Thanks, Sarthak. Thanks for the nice introduction. And welcome to all of you, panelists and participants on Zoom and on YouTube. Very quickly, where is this idea of a deep webinar, right? We just coined it, okay? We just coined the phrase. And the reason is because I personally got fed up of webinars, right? I got fed up of Zoom because most people were using Zoom as some kind of a replacement for a monologue or a dialogue between two people, which got just so boring. Now, we've been using Zoom and webinars for our online education programs for the last 10 years. And in our classes, when we use webinars, we use them very interactively. It's a platform for faculty and students to interact with each other in a very different way from what was happening in webinars that we saw. That, in a webinar in the COVID world, was really about two heads going on and on and on for an hour or so. And, you just had to sit there and put up with it. And, if you're lucky, you would be able to sneak in a question or two if they would even listen. So we changed this. So what we're trying to do with a deep webinar is really to get a really, really interesting speaker and a bunch of discussants who come from various parts, of society, various walks of life, and are very interesting, right? It's not necessary that, of course, the panelists here today, the discussants here today know a little bit about this subject, but it's not necessary for people to know about the subject to be a discussant. And I think that's what makes it interesting, that you have a conversation with people who are not necessarily experts, which allows all of us to plug in and have a great enriched conversation. Now, what we're doing in addition to this is you can of course post questions on Zoom and on YouTube, and I mean, I'll try and pick that up as much as you can. But don't just look at that as a question that you want to post. You can post your comments. It's as much a conversation that you can have online with other people as much you're having with the panelists, right? And then the most interesting thing we're trying to do, and this is an experiment, is that we have a segment on our website called Deep Webinar, which was shared on the link here, takshashila.org.in/deep webinar, where you can actually propose topics and speakers that you want to use for the next ones, right? So that the subsequent deep webinars are where you could actually choose the topics, and we'll try our best to get the right people or the right the right forums to engage these speakers. So in other words, we want to have this as an ongoing conversation of interesting people. There are a lot of people on this webinar. I think that's Puja's star and celebrity power, which is driving people here. But I'm happy with a small number of people who are having this conversation. It's not necessary for us to have thousands or hundreds of people. It's not that you run into a celebrity like Puja every day, but to have these high quality conversations is what this is all about, right? And Puja, of course, coming to today's thing needs no introduction. You've read her book, and she's extremely available on Twitter. She engages people on Twitter. I mean, that comes with its pros and cons. But I think for looking for sane voices online on Twitter and social media, Puja is definitely one of them. So we're really grateful that she could spend time with us. And if this was a real conversation, on a physical conversation, we would have had a books to open and give away. But I could just suggest that you go to Amazon and pick up the book. It's if you have a 200 over rupees, it's the best thing you can buy for 200 rupees, 200 plus rupees today, right? So Puja, welcome. What I just say is, why don't you just talk about your experience writing the book for the first 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go on and make this conversation interesting.
Right. Thank you, Mehra. Thank you, Takshila, for inviting me to your first deep webinar in such kind words. You're very generous. My experience of writing the book, the book happened mainly because I felt as somebody who lives in India, who's a part of the economy, who has observed the economy, very disappointed in the way I thought the economy had been run.
Your voice is not coming through. Your
is it better now?
It's better now.
Is it better now? Yeah. So I was saying that the reason I wrote the book is because as an individual who is a part of the economy, I felt extremely frustrated and disappointed in the way the economy had been handled in the 10-year period that I write about. And I thought that not only the economy's future, but individually, each of our futures had the promise that it held, had been snatched away from us. Whatever futures, economic futures were within our reach individually had been pushed further away because of the way policy had been handled. And so in that sense, that was my personal sort of entry into the decision to write this book and the way it got structured. It is easier for me to write this book, I guess, than a lot of many other people because of my experience with being a journalist, a reporter, being there on the ground, meeting with and interviewing in many cases most of the policymakers, and having some experience of building narratives. And I received a lot of help in conceptualizing the book, in deciding what to keep in, what to keep out from my friends, great economists like Lighten, Dr. Shobhisai, and that's how it came about.
But what strikes me is that when you choose the topic 2008 to 2018, what's really interesting about it is it cuts across two political parties with very different views at least stated views on what economic policy ought to be, right? And also in this very partisan kind of a time where it's very easy to blame everybody from Nehru to Vajpayee to whoever is a person you don't like for all the problems, avoiding the near past, right? So how did that work out for you? Did you get a lot of partisan pressure in terms of your interpretation of the last 10 years?
Not really, because since I have covered most of these institutions and the economy since the year 2000, which is when Vajpayee was the prime minister. So I had a sort of a background coming into looking at this space, and when I spoke with policymakers, for instance, most of them actually hold the view that both the two governments, there is a lot in common in them. There is a slide that starts in UPA 2, which only deepens in NDA 1, that is Mr. Modi's first government. And there is a difference, of course, between the coarseness of handling things in the first Modi government. For instance, their handling of differences with economics or the RBI. But materially, the kind of chaos in policy making that there is between the two governments, there's not that much of a difference. And that is what I've tried to bring down. There's really not much to choose between the two. And a lot of people ask me, why is it that I did not, I started from 2008 and ended 2018. Why did I not look at starting 2004 or something like that? And the reason for that is that in my view, after looking at everything that I managed to get when I was researching and reporting for my book, I find that the economic cycle does not necessarily overlap the political cycle. And that's the reason, it really is not, as I say in the introduction, this government versus that government sort of thing. I find a lot of parallels between the two, which is only natural, right?
Yeah.
The system is the same, the people are the same.
Yeah, and I also feel that it's like saying you can have any wing that you like as long as it's left wing, right? Because if you look at the political beliefs of the parties in power, they still want the role of the state, price regulation. It's not that the so-called right wing is not really a proponent of free market economics, smaller hand of the states, lower taxation, etc. Right? I mean, whatever they might claim in rhetoric, in action, they actually supporters of larger role for the state in the economy, and that's both the NDA as well as the UPA 1 and 2, right? In terms of the role of the state, it's a question of what role of the state, where does the in what form does it place, what is the political economy of that role? That seems to be the difference. But Puja, before we go on, I just want to ask our attendees. I have a poll. And if Sarthak can just release the poll, I just want to have a sense of it so that you also know. How many of us really felt that the past was a problem? Can you release the poll, Sarthak?
Yeah, well, yes, you are doing that.
Yeah, and Puja, your mic also seems to have a problem, but if you could sort it out somehow. Yeah, here's the poll, guys. How many of you really think that 2008 to 18 was the last decade? You could choose yes or no, and I'm not quite sure how the results will be published. Sarthak, will we know the results real time or?
Yeah, we'll let you know. Just I'm giving them 5 seconds more.
Okay, take a couple of minutes to answer this. So let's have the conversation in the meantime. So Puja, your fundamental argument was that the politics of the country does not allow economics, the right kind of economics to take place, right? Which is the reason why we lost this decade, and we now have a situation where there is a growth. At least in 2018, there was growth without a story. Now there's no growth and no story, right? But really, if we take that idea that the politics itself does not allow good economic policy, then is there a sense of doom here? That in the sense that everything is so overly predetermined that there's very little that we can expect in terms of being able to change the direction of the ship of state. That's question one. And if that was so, how is it that in 1991, 92, we managed to turn it around?
So both the questions are related. I think that we do show promise for corrections when there is a crisis. And that's what happened in 1991. It happened again in 2008 when the global financial crisis happened and politicians allowed a lot of space and freedom to professional economists in government and the RBI to do what was needed for crisis management. Sometimes in the process of crisis management, some long-standing, long required reforms get pushed along. And I think the reason for that is, and probably the 1991 crisis, that the politician is wary of being seen as not managing a crisis well. No politician wants to be seen as overseeing for instance, handing over of India's gold, to Bank of England and Bank of Japan and things like that. So that sense of national shame, makes the politician yield space to the technical policy maker. And some economists who are in government are able to then use that space to push for reforms. They know how to work the system. It doesn't happen all the time. It's not happening right now, for instance. But when the combinations are right, the individuals, and both politicians and economists, it does happen. But you're right that given what the political, there's in fact a complete failure of political ideology, right? Economic ideology, right? Both in the UPA too, we saw the cabinet, the reformers being Monteg Singh Ahluwalia, P. Chidambaram, the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh himself, pushing for something, and the rest of the cabinet preventing them from doing that. For instance, in the case of the Land Acquisition Act, or in the case of the Food Security Act, despite policy paralysis, those legislations went through, but GST did not go through. So, every government has these pulls and pressures of different people with different ideologies, and we find that most of the time the status quoists win, and the pro-reformers are not able to resist the pressures from them. And we find the same thing happen in the Modi government. The Modi government wanted to fix the land acquisition, had plans initially of Make in India, but a couple of losses in state elections in 2015 and 16, and they could, Make in India got sidelined. All of the other plans they had for reforms got sidelined. Things like demonetization began to take place. GST itself became more of a tool for political messaging rather than a tax reform. So the non-reformers seem to be winning.
Yeah. What I also found, especially with the Modi government, is that, sometimes I think the Prime Minister himself is able to define the outcomes, but is not quite clued in on what does it take to get you there. Because a lot of economics is non-intuitive. Even for example, this idea of Atmanirbhar. Atmanirbhar is a great idea. Self-reliance is a great idea. But paradoxically, to get to a self-reliant India, you need to have open borders. You need to have openness to trade, right? So if you say Atmanirbhar and raise import duties, you get back into the 70s and the 80s, and you end up in a situation where you're not Atmanirbhar, right? So I think the non-intuitiveness of economics, right, and the suspicion, and I think some part of the suspicion is valid, but in general it's not. But particular suspicion that there are certain intellectuals or economists who are beholden to politics or political ideologies which differ from those in power. I think that is also something at play, because you see prominent economists or celebrity economists having wedded themselves to certain set of ideas. Right now, if you take Amartya Sen, for example, he's wedded himself to this rights-based discourse. Now, if I'm a politician who does not believe in the politics that leads to the rights-based discourse, I'm not likely to trust that guy, right? So I think that's part of what has also made it, hard for people to distrust, economists to distrust. But that still doesn't answer why, for example, some of the biggest prominent, world's most prominent advocates of free trade, Jagdish Bhagwati and Pangadia, who are, deep supporters of the Modi politics and the BJP, still have not been able to, make much of a dent in the way, economic policy takes. How does that? Did you spend some time thinking about it?
Yes. So to first, just on Atmanirbhar itself, I wanted to say that, the one example I always give to everybody is because a lot of youngsters I find seem to have bought into, like you're saying, it's not easy to see, how poorly thought out it is. And a lot of youngsters have bought into it, and, they believe that licensing is the only way to make sure domestic industry will grow large enough to be able to take on competition from other countries. The example I always give to them is that of the cricket team, and I always tell them that, do you think you will have a world-class cricket team beating the world's best cricket teams if you restrict their exposure to just the Ranji teams and just domestic cricket? For you to have a globally competitive team, you have to allow them to play global cricket. And that sort of always gets the point across. It's the same for trade and industrial manufacturing. On politicians and economists, I think politicians cannot possibly understand the the technical economics, and therefore it is up to their advisors to sensitize them to the technical aspects and why these things are necessary. And that becomes even more important when you do not have an economic ideology guiding you. Now, as I've argued, not in the book but outside of it in my writings, that the problem currently with this government is that they do not have anybody who's a go-to person for the Prime Minister. So, for instance, what Dr. Vijay Kelkar was to Prime Minister Vajpayee, or what A.N. Verma was to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. Of course, Dr. Manmohan Singh is himself an economist, but even he relied, because probably he did not have that much time to only think about the economy. He relied a great deal on people like Dr. Kirit Parekh, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I can't think of a single bureaucrat, technocrat in the current government who could be guiding the Prime Minister's policy decisions and sensitizing him to the technical aspects of economic policy. And in which case, I think what is happening is, and I don't see any minister also doing it. So what is probably happening is that different lobby groups are going to various ministers or bureaucrats, Prime Minister, seeking what is very poorly thought out but very good in the immediate for this particular group, and that is getting accepted. Nobody's thinking of the big picture, and clearly the Prime Minister's office is not consulting with even the Niti Aayog, because I can't think of, Dr. Panagria and Professor Bhagwati are still far removed. I can't think of Dr. Vivek Debroy approving of something like licensing policies. And clearly he is not being consulted, because if he were, I'm quite sure he would be able to persuade the Prime Minister or the Minister concerned about how regressive these policies are. So there seems to be a policy capture by interested lobbies, and the consultative process has collapsed. And there seems to be no 1, 2, 3. There is, of course, the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, which is never met, not even once. So I don't think the Prime Minister is consulting enough. He doesn't have a go-to technocrat, bureaucrat, for this sort of a consultative process. And that's what's playing out. There's a vacuum on it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Puja. I think it's time for me to bring our discussants in. So the discussants really are the voices of the 100 attendees or 200 attendees who are there. So I can't get all 200 people to speak, but the panel, the discussants hopefully will be their voices. the poll already showed that 70% of the participants are already sold on your book. There are about 30% who don't believe that it was a lost decade. So later I'll try and get one of those people who raised their hands to say to probably explain why they voted that way. But in the meantime, let me just get Anika and Harsh. Anika, is a student. She's just entered her undergrad career. Harsh is an investor. So Anika first, and Harsh, if you could make your comments, questions, statements very briefly. Anika first.
Yeah. Hi. So one thing that I noticed in the book also was this theme of politics being detrimental to long-term economic policy in India. And so I had a question about, do you think that the constant cycle of state and central election rewards this politically expedient decisions versus more long-term tough thinking that we probably need? And do you think some sort of structural reform in our election process might be a solution to the approach that governments take towards policy in India?
Thanks, Anika. Harsh? Harsh, you're muted.
Yes. So Puja, first of all, I would like to commend you on your book because being from an economic and finance background, we had studied a lot about the economic disruptions going on post the 2008 global financial crisis. But the idea that you bring forth that the bypass surgery that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh underwent in 2008, right, and the terrorist attacks in Mumbai. They probably had a larger effect on the disruptions that were to follow, the disruptions to growth that were to follow in the forthcoming years. So that provided a really nice perspective.
Sorry, I lost.
Yes, Puja.
Sorry, I'm saying your voice is not clear.
Okay, is it?
We missed the last 30 seconds of what you said. We missed the last 30 seconds of what you said. Never mind, Puja. I think why don't you just go on? He'll come online.
Sure. So Anika, to your question, you see, the politics. There are two kinds of politics. One is that of electoral funding, which results in the kind of tensions that we saw in the UPA one on the whole scams related to allocation of natural resources, the policy paralysis and the anti-corruption movement, etc. And the second is that of vote catching politics, which goes on in rural areas, affects policies of farm MSPs, minimum support prices, or policies of fertilizer pricing reforms, or policies of what the Narendra Modi government has introduced, and it calls welfare. A welfare approach where public spending pushes basic services into states and villages. For instance, public provision of cheap loans or housing, etc. Many of which actually fall under the state government's work allocation. So I don't think that we need to we look at the election processes for this. I'm not an expert on these matters, but my very lay view is that this is not really something. This is just very lazy politics, right? The politics of populism versus the politics of electoral funding. Now, this is just very lazy, It's just that we expect so little of our politicians. We don't vote to put enough pressure on our politicians for them to think long term, think of economic issues. I mean, the last Lok Sabha election happened in the midst of extreme economic distress, both in the rural economy as well as in the urban economy. Domestic consumption had collapsed by the time voting happened. And yet, the incumbent government returned to office with a larger mandate. And that, I mean, again, I'm not a political analyst at all, but what it tells me is that the economic hardships just did not count with the voters because they were so enamored by the entire narrative that had been built up on the whole strong PM and security issues and your pesky neighbors, etc. I'm not sure that we need to touch around the elections bit. This is just the ability of the politicians to capture the voters' mind space. So this is what the voters want, and this is what they're getting in some sense. And Harsh, I didn't quite get what your question was. I'm sorry, I could hear the first part where you talked about the two non-politics, non-economic events that I bring out in this first and the second chapter on the bypass surgery Dr. Singh went through, and followed by the terror attack, which basically brought Pranab Mukherjee into the finance ministry. But what exactly the question is, I didn't get.
So that provided a new perspective to me, being from this background. Now, the specific question I have is pertains to the fiscal situation of India right now, of the government right now. So you discuss extensively in your book about the fiscal response that the UPA 2 government implemented post the 2008 global financial crisis, right? We had the fiscal stimulus part 1 and part 2 during Chidambaram's time. And then we had the fiscal overdose during Pranab Mukherjee's time, post 2009, right? And we had a fiscal deficit, a huge expansion of fiscal deficit and inflation and all that thing in the UPA 2 period. Now, when we come to the NDA government's period, one set of arguments is that the Modi government has more or less been able to control the fiscal deficit. Also, we know that a lot of the fiscal deficit has been gone off budget, right? For instance, the Food Corporation of India's payments have been delayed, and Food Corporation of India has had to borrow from the market, which does not reflect in the official fiscal deficit numbers. So the argument from that section is that the fiscal deficit has more or less been contained. Now, when we come to the coronavirus, the situation that we are facing now, COVID, we also know that the government did not end up spending as much as claimed, right? So for instance, the figure of 20 lakh crore, most of that includes interest subvention schemes or guarantees and stuff like that. And the actual cash outlay or the actual public spending is only about 2 lakh crores, which is about 1% of GDP. So, is one, and the article that Ratin Roy today wrote in Business Standard, which you tweeted as well, the containment of fiscal deficit or the relative containment of fiscal deficit during the NDA period, during the Modi government period, is that actually by design rather than political willingness, right? Because the government does not have enough fiscal space to spend. It cannot borrow because that could threaten our investment grade status. The credit rating agencies could downgrade our investment grade status. So borrowing is constrained. The government cannot tax enough, right? Because the space is limited for taxing. The only other option that obviously the government is also seeking increased dividends from the RBI. But the fourth option is that the government could ask the RBI to monetize its debt, right? My question is, is that monetization of debt actually possible now? Because there are arguments for it, and especially given that this is a special situation.
Yeah. And I think let's just pause you there. Let's pause you there. I think the question really, Puja, if I were to make it a little more generalized question, is that how much of attention to this fiscal deficit business did you see in the various various governments over the past 10 years? And then to take Harsh's point, this whole business of taking the RBI's money and turning it into some kind of miraculous amounts of cash, is that something that's really feasible given the politics and the economics?
So the FRBM Act, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which was necessary, which was conceived for correcting the long-standing problem of use of the central government's budget by successive governments over decades, not just this decade, but many previous governments, which landed us, by the way, into the balance of payments problem partly in 1991. So that whole process started with the Vajpayee government. They actually passed this act. It was notified in 2004 when P. Chidambaram became the first finance minister of the UPA 1. And he did very well, in fact, to reduce the fiscal deficit to under 2%. The kind of fiscal correction that P. Chidambaram in UPA 1 was able to deliver, no other finance minister has been able to deliver. If you look at specific tenures in the reduction. Of course, he was able to do it because the economy was booming, because the global economy was booming. He was able to raise tax collections, and also I think he was able to plug leakages. Ratan Roy's article, which Harsh mentioned today, brings out that how the tax GDP ratio when he was the finance minister has not been improved by any finance minister before or after that. So he did very well on that. When Pranab Mukherjee became the finance minister, as Harsh is saying, and my book brings out, finance ministry lost complete, they decided to sort of let go of all controls, and the fiscal deficit blew to the sky. They overstimulated the economy. Only thing being, Pranab Mukherjee was transparent. He did not, he brought all the off-budget fiscal deficit items into the budget, and he stated them very transparently. When the Modi government joined office in 2014, a lot of noise was made on how Mr. Modi is a fiscal hawk. But I'm afraid he was very lucky in many ways, like P. Chidambaram was in 2004, because oil prices crashed. Global oil prices crashed from $120 per barrel to $20 per barrel in a matter of a couple of weeks. And what the Modi government did, and this was not a political decision, this was actually the handiwork of some very sharp bureaucrats in the finance ministry. What they did is that they made a case for, although food prices had dropped, they made a case for the taxes on retail prices of petrol to be maintained at a higher level, so that the tax collections from sale of petrol could be used to make good the fiscal deficit situation that had been bequeathed to this government by the previous government. Of course, in the last 18 months of the UPA, P. Chidambaram again really, he was very harsh, and he really cut down expenditures, and he did reduce the fiscal deficit, but he paid a price for that in terms of growth, as he concedes on record in the book. But the Modi government was able to compress the fiscal deficit because of the oil bonanza. I thought that they had great opportunity because the economy was, GDP growth was on an uptrend, and they had a great opportunity there to improve the tax GDP ratio. But we don't see in the numbers anything like that. And this last year's budget and this year's budget, sorry, not last year's budget. This year's budget, the finance minister had to in fact make a case for the escape clause under the FRBM, because even before COVID, even with no crisis, she had missed the fiscal deficit target under the FRBM Act, and she wanted to get the RBI to monetize, because the escape clause in the FRBM does that. It allows you to ask the RBI to monetize a part of the deficit. And by the way, the Modi government 2 years back deleted the the condition of bringing revenue deficit to zero from the FRBM Act. So I don't agree when people say that the Modi government is a fiscal hawk. I don't think they are. Their fiscal stance has been as loose as any other government in the last few years. And also, like Harsh said, that the off-budget items help them camouflage that. Arvind Subramanian has brought that out very well in his book. So therefore, what do? They go and knock on the doors of the RBI, which again, they're not the first ones to do. A lot of other governments have done it. Puja government himself has done it. They go and ask RBI for money. The Modi government does it a little more, in a more strident way. They end up burning bridges with the RBI. They end up using governors to exit and quit. That is what the Modi government is paying the price for, right? If they had not in the last 2 years extracted the kind of surpluses from the RBI, they would have had that reserve money for use in this emergency now. They exhausted all of that options, and today they are left with, no emergency recourse for spending to fight the COVID crisis. And so I would say that, on macroeconomic management, the Modi government has made these mistakes, and they're paying the price.
Okay, I'll bring in the other two guys, Subrat and Amol. In that order, Subrat and Amol, can you just speak up?
Right. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Puja. So, Puja, I'm not an economist. Just as a layperson, two questions. One is the way when you read the book, you find that you have two contrasting images of our prime ministers, right? So one is a prime minister who defers to his finance minister, doesn't assert himself, and on the other end, we have a prime minister who's quite assertive, takes decision when the finance minister is in vacation or on a flight. And you have a lost decade because individuals matter, institutions don't seem to matter. So, I mean, how do we look at this? I mean, this idea of institutions, checks and balances, is that a fundamental flaw or weakness in our democracy? Because elections and populist, drives or populist instincts exist in all democracies, but possibly institutions or checks and balances take care of them. So that's one question. And the second question is, as a country and as people, and I think you mentioned this at the beginning, are we just instinctively statist and instinctively sort of anti whatever profit and anti business in that sense, that it's very easy to sort of stoke some of those instincts, and once you have the people going that way, then politics will follow, which then gets compounded when you don't have good institutions.
I mostly agree with what you're saying, because I was just having this conversation this afternoon with an economist on institutions versus individuals, and I was saying that our institutions are weak, our institutional frameworks are weak, and individuals, everything depends on individuals. If you have a good chief election commissioner who's willing to stand his ground, or a CAG like Vinod Rai, who's decided that he wants to expose something, whether or not it's there on the books, they're able to get away with it. They're able to do it. But, at the same time, if you have an RBI governor who's going to allow a one-time restructuring of loans for the 100th time, that one-time restructuring of loans will take place. So it depends on individuals because the institutions are weak. And this economist replied to me saying that, that's not really, that's not how he sees it, because there are a lot of powers in the acts, there are a lot of powers in the underlying legislations, which if individuals want, they can use. So it seems to me that what happens is that political regimes manage institutions through appointments. If a particular individual in an institution is not pliable, situations are created, the heat is turned on and situations are created where people leave, and then you bring in people who are more likely to listen to. That seems to be happening in the last 5 years. that did not happen in the UPA too, where everybody, was sort of an authority to themselves, and the finance minister, as I bring out in my book, was not even on talking terms with the prime minister, and the prime minister wanted certain files approved, and the finance minister was not responding to the prime minister's office, and they were forced to interact through messengers. So between institutions and individuals, it seems to me that political regimes are able to manage these things depending on how much they are willing to subvert convention, legislations, and appointments. The whole way of appointing individuals to these positions.
Amol?
Yeah, Nitin, this has been a very serious sort of a conversation. So let me lighten it up a bit. So Puja, I kind of read your book and I've been recommending it to my students and so on and so forth. And I see some of them joined in. So as I was reading the book, it was like reading Shakespeare, with several characters, several Shakespeare stories narrated. There's comedy of errors. There is, and by the way, there's, all these Macbeth, Othello kind of characters.
And there's King Lear.
Yeah. So, by the way, you must, write to Vishal Bhardwaj, who might, turn your book into some kind of a movie for all of us to see. Vishal Bhardwaj, who's done some fabulous, accounts of, turning Othello into Omkara and so on and so forth. So, but taking that thing a little forward, it's kind of very curious. You've looked at several actors in the book, and let me stick to those actors. I can still understand the UPA too getting its act wrong on politics or stuff like that, but how does it get the act wrong on economics? You have Manmohan Singh as the economist. I mean, you have so many economists: Monte Ahluwalia, Rangarajan, Kaushik Basu, Raghuram Rajan, who was prime minister's personal advisor, and then becomes the chief economic advisor, and then the RBI governor. Within the RBI, you have Subbarao, Gokan, Urjit Patel, Rajan. Though they come in later, but how come all these guys just could not get their acts together on the economics front? Was it a case? I mean, and some of them had tremendous experience in terms of 91 reform, 91 crisis, 98 crisis, and the 2008 crisis. I mean, one could imagine that 2008 crisis, they sort of, got it wrong. But, what we get from your book and what we understand that it's basically post 2008. So you managed a Herculean sort of a crisis, but then you couldn't manage something which was not as big a crisis. And so many economists. And is that the reason why the current government shuns economists' advice?
Amol, I think, is it marginal utility of economists?
I leave that to Puja to answer.
Yeah, Amol, you're absolutely right. And I think I also say this in the book that I think the reason I would go along with, although my book is not conclusive, but the reason I do say that the reason seems to be Dr. Manmohan Singh's personality. His cabinet is full of people who are anti-reform, who are they don't like markets, for instance. They don't believe.
But there's
in
just one
reforms.
Pranab Mukherjee, right? Just one Pranab Mukherjee.
Amol, there were
No,
many.
there are many others.
Okay.
There are many examples in the book. And for instance, the urea pricing reform, the cabinet note is prepared by the ministry and it comes to the cabinet. And the minister in charge says that, no, please don't discuss this reform right now because this cabinet note has been prepared in a language, it was prepared in English, in a language that I don't speak and I don't understand. He's saying this in the cabinet meeting. He's in charge of that particular ministry, So the UP2 was such a chaotic cabinet where at any pretext, just about anybody could completely derail, government decision making. There were many ministers who were ideologically completely polar opposite of what these reformers that you're talking about, Mantik Singh Ahluwalia and Manmohan Singh, what they were, even Anand Sharma I would include in that, what they believed in And these anti-reformers very often succeeded in not letting the cabinet take the decisions that the prime minister would want. And I asked in the book, I asked Puja on the Land Acquisition Act, for instance. I said he says that he did not believe. He thought that the Land Acquisition Amendment that the UPA 2 did was not a good amendment. The intention was right, but what that amendment does is it makes it impossible for anybody to acquire land. So I said, but you're part of the cabinet decision that approves it. Did you not say in the cabinet meeting that this is wrong? So he said, no, I said it was wrong, but ultimately decision has to be taken by consensus. And more ministers thought that, that decision had to be taken. Or for instance, when the Vodafone retrospective amendment is done by Pranab Mukherjee, I repeat it in my book, but actually originally Pranab Mukherjee was written about it in his own book, where he says that, in Parliament House, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Sonia Gandhi, P. Chidambaram, Kapil Sibal take him to a corner and tell him not to go ahead with this Vodafone retrospective amendment that he's planning. And they tell him that how it would make India unattractive to investors. He writes that he didn't listen to them because he thought what he was doing is right. And even today, he thinks what he did is right. He's not willing to accept even now that that is a sort of a turning point for India in terms of India's image to investors, overseas, and also the mood domestically for economy. And there are so many such examples of people who are completely able to oppose and resist, what the prime minister wants. If the prime minister doesn't assert himself, and as I say, at no point does it happen that the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh says that, well, this is what you believe, but I'm your Prime Minister and I'm asking you to do this. He just does not exercise his authority as Prime Minister even once. And I think that's what explains, why, despite all this, wealth of expertise at his disposal on economy, he could not. The economy suffered so much under him.
Yeah, one thing, since the analogy was of Shakespeare, I think one of the people we forget in the UPA's term is Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, right, who had very strong convictions on ideological issues, which certainly would have played on the mind of the Prime Minister, because he was not, he was not as independent a Prime Minister as Mr. Modi is, for example, right? So, or his predecessors were. So that probably was also one of the angles here. Now, I just want to ask if anyone of the audience who had said that it's not a lost decade, right? There were about 23 of you who said it was not a lost decade. If you raise your hand, I could just ask you to, I don't know whether it's possible to pass the mic to you, but I'd ask you to say, why do you think it was not a lost decade, right? So if any of you would like to speak up, you could just raise your hand and I will try and come to you. In the meantime, Puja, I just want to ask you one question, right? And I just want to bring you back to my earlier question was, really, is it so overdetermined that our politics will never allow us to get onto the right economic path?
Let me think of it this way. Let's say, do you see Prime Minister Modi changing? Do you see him bringing an advisor who he will listen to? I don't. Let's say that, for some reason, Prime Minister Modi is not the Prime Minister. Do you see any other politician in his place willing to listen to good advice on the economy? I can't think of anybody, maybe if Mr. Arun Jaitley was the Prime Minister, there may have been some, scope. Maybe if Mr. Nitin Gadkari becomes the Prime Minister, there could be some scope. But I really don't see, any patience with technical advice in the current crop of politicians. The way there was, if you read Baivi Reddy's book, it's amazing how he describes, that Jaswant Singh is the finance minister, and Jaswant Singh wants him to do something, and he goes and briefs the finance minister, saying that finance minister, I think if you do this, these are going to be the implications of it. ramifications of it, and therefore I think we should not do this. I think we should do what I'm saying. And Jaswant Singh says, okay, we will go with what you're saying. There's a lot of pressure on us, to do what I'm saying. But since you are so convinced and you persuaded me, I will go along with you. I will abandon my position. I don't see any politicians, in the current crop who will do something like that. I mean, when Manmohan Singh has not been able to do it, who will?
Right. Hey, Sarthak, can you unlock the second poll? I just want to get a sense from the audience. What do you think will be, prospects for the future based on this discussion? Do you expect India to regain the growth story? Because Puja's argument is now it's no story here. But are we going to regain the growth story in the next 10 years? As you think of answering this question, I just want to ask one thing, which one of the Saurabh Agarwal has asked in the Q&A. He says, "Are you going to write a next book called Another Lost Decade, 2019 to 2029? Is that going to be your next book?" I mean, he's really optimistic here.
So many people have said this to me. RBI governors have said this to me. What I always tell everybody is that, if I were to write about another lost decade, I'd probably fall into depression. Things going wrong so much. But it's too soon, I think, to say right now. I will definitely probably want to write a sequel to my book, but let's see what it's going to be in another few years.
And if you were to update this book, given the last 2 years, what would you add to it?
I would not be able to say growth without a story. I would have to say, like you said in the beginning, no growth, no story. But I mean, it's not just a lost decade. I'm really very, I see things they're very bleak now. It's just a lost cause now. I'll probably call it, India the lost cause now. We are talking, economists are talking about India falling into the middle income trap. So all that promise that we used to talk of, is that promise, valid still? The economic potential is lost, is it, it may be reversible, but I don't see the, conditions conducive for it to be reversible. So it's a lost cause, I think. It's no longer lost.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I'm sorry for being so pessimistic.
No, it's okay. You see, I have a counterpoint to that. But the host, the sharing of the poll, it shows that there's a very narrow margin. 2 people out of the 52 people who voted, 25 say that it's going to be we are going to regain the growth story, and 27, 2 extra people, 27 say we are not going to regain the growth story. And what really it tells me is that economic growth is a social construct. If enough number of people believe that we need to regain the growth story, we will, because that, especially in a democracy, we will. And if we start believing that it's really a lost cause, we say this as people in the space, right? As being inside the confines of what we think. We might believe that it's really dark and desperate, but a lot of people who are not necessarily tuned into the ins and outs, people who have not read your book, for example, people who these are the people, if they believe that.
Let me put it this way: if whatever next state election is coming, I don't know which one it's going to be. If enough number of people vote, sending a message that the economy is what counts, I'm quite sure things will get done. I'm quite sure the Prime Minister will appoint the right advisors. He would listen to them. He would do what they say. The message has to come from the voters. So if that message begins to come, yes, I think things will get corrected in a matter of 2 years. When I say I'm pessimistic because despite everything, I don't see people, voting for economic issues, to alleviate their own economic hardship. They just seem to be putting up with, so much loss of, economic well-being. it's very strange, Their own economic condition matters less than some politics about some whatever religious matters and things, etc. It's very strange, and maybe political analysts should explain this. I don't understand this.
Yeah, in my more pessimistic and cynical moments, I know I've always seen that where this is an argument which I've been having with political science like Pratap Bhanumehta and others. That some in my more cynical moments, I feel that the Indian voter disconnects the economic consequences to his or her political choices. That the economic consequences are more fatalistic. They're like the monsoon or the weather, and when it happens, we just have to deal with it. It's the connection between my pressing that polling button on the booth and what happens to me seems to be disconnected, right? But I think the political analysts I speak to sort of disagree with me, and then there's a debate that the voter has a very instinctive feel of what is necessary at this point, and to the extent that people are contented with their situation, they feel that they want to explore other parts, whether it's spiritual or religious or social kind of an agenda. But when the economic waters run low and the tide is out, and you realize that, oh my God, I really am short of money, and my well-being is affected, I would go in and vote accordingly. Now that's the theory. We don't know, and I think the coming years will play this out. And I think the pandemic has made it even more acute, because at this point, all the errors of the mistakes of the past have just been washed out in the simple fact that you have a huge crisis, right? And it's also a golden opportunity for the government to change policy if it wants, because it can do so without necessarily having to admit that it had made mistakes in the past, right? So on that note, I think we've reached 6:30. We should close this at exactly at an hour. I really want to thank you, Puja, for being with us, and the four discussants for raising issues as interesting as elections to Macbeth, and all of you who participated. Just to let you know, you can go to our website, takshashila.org.in/deep webinar, and ask for topics that you want to discuss in the future. And you can also go to our website, because we'll be putting up a mind map of this conversation for further engagement. So this particular conversation doesn't end here. It moves on to our website, and you could engage each other and Puja. If there are important issues, we'll get her and ask her to respond to some questions. Okay. So on that note, thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and make sure you go to amazon.in and buy her book if you've not done so already. Okay. Thank you very much, and see you again.